Welcome to this week's Let's Talk Paranormal, and for part 2 of our Varginha crash in Brazil back in 1996. And of course, my very special guest today, Dr. Roger Leir, who was one of the investigators on the case and the author of this incredible book, UFO Crash in Brazil. You can take a look at this and more information on our website, letstalkparanormal.com. And of course, Dr. Roger Leir is well respected all over the world for his research into alien implants. And a physician, a successful physician for the last 41 years here in the state of California. And we're delighted he's back to share part 2 of this incredible story. Welcome back, Dr. Leir.
Good to be back again with you, Tracie.
Good, thank you. You know, your research was quite involved with this from what we were discussing in part 1 last week, Dr. Leir. And we were discussing the journey of why these beings were here. And how do you think the U.S. government knew about this at the time?
Oh, I think it's quite obvious that the U.S. government not only knew but was involved in every way with the case. For example, the notification by NORAD, the notification of the Brazilian military. Now, just because it's the military, it doesn't mean that they're an autonomous group. You know, the military is part of what? It's part of the Brazilian government. So obviously, the Brazilian government had to know what was going on. Mm-hmm. Plus the fact that I have seen, and I've had up on my website, documents that I brought back from Brazil, which were signed with NASA. You know, signed by Daniel Golden, and essentially the documents say that, you know, the United States would develop commercially anything that the Brazilians gave them that could be developed from, you know, extraterrestrial sources, mm-hmm. and that they would share with the Brazilian government. So sure, Americans knew. Americans were seen in University of Campinas, where the autopsy of one or more of these beings were performed by a very famous Brazilian pathologist, Dr. Baden Palares. Mm-hmm. And most people might remember him. He was the one who described the bones of the Nazi war criminal Mengele. So yes, very definitely involved.
Now, if this event had taken place on United States soil, how different do you think this case would have been handled?
I think it would have been quite a bit different, because I don't even think it would have received the notoriety that it received, even with a small article in the Wall Street Journal or the World Press getting a notice of this. I don't think that would have happened at all. Plus, the Brazilians were left to do the work. And I think that the U.S. military or special ops group or whoever it is that handles this probably has a lot more experience in the crash retrieval cleanup than the Brazilians do. So, mm-hmm. you know, maybe in Varginha there are still pieces of something that are laying in the field there.
How has this event affected the residents of Varginha?
Well, interestingly enough, the residents were sort of put upon by the authorities to shut up and not talk a lot about this case, and certainly don't talk about the involvement of the Americans, and they don't want ufologists from all over the world tramping around Varginha. But now, as the years have gone by, around town there's some statues of what these alien beings look like. There's a couple of shops I went through. You can buy little carved models. And just recently, the city has put up a monument, a circular monument to this event that occurred. And so the city has really gotten on the bandwagon, mm-hmm. now.
Didn't they put that just outside of a gas station?
Yes.
That monument? Because
yes,
we have a picture
of
of it here.
Yeah, it kind of sits at a square, and there's a gas station on one corner. It's a very busy intersection. But these are the things that you can find, little wood carvings and so on, of these beings. Mm-hmm.
Now, let's get back to the capture of these beings. You wanted to talk about 2 particular captures in particular.
Well, the capture of one of the beings was one that I told you about, that the military intelligence officer just assisted into the car. So we'll call that one of the captures. And we can go on to see what happened. The other one, definitely one, perhaps two, but we know one for sure, that was kind of chased down a small mountainside. There was a railroad track and then this little shallow valley with a grove of trees. And the being was chased into the trees and then captured there and brought out in a sack, which was over the shoulder of one of the military people. And then the witnesses described how they struggled to get this sack, walking, trying to get it back up to the hill and then put into a vehicle and taken away. Now, we have the being that was seen by the three girls. I was able to find out when I was there that it was only a short distance between the area where the girls saw this first being and where this other being was captured by the two military police officers.
Okay.
And undoubtedly, it's probably a pretty good conjecture to think that maybe this was the same being, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, the close proximity to where the girls saw it, and secondly, this being was injured with an injured leg, and perhaps that's why the being was kneeling in the first place, because he was injured.
Absolutely.
So the military police officers took this being, first of all, to a first aid station where they were told they couldn't get help for it there. Then they took it to a hospital regional. After it left Hospital Regional, it went to a third hospital, Humanitas Hospital. Now, two things happened here independently. The military police officer, Marco Eli Charese, 23 years old, thoroughly healthy human being, was dead in less than 3 weeks following exposure to this being.
Wow.
And his symptoms were unknown. They were not told to the members of the family and so on. Everything was a secret. And I did an interview with the wife of this deceased military police officer. It was a very interesting interview, not because I was able to learn anything, but because I was able to learn nothing. Every question that I asked this woman, she didn't have an answer for. I asked her, what were your husband's symptoms before he went to the hospital? She said, I don't know. And what were his symptoms when he was in the hospital? I don't know. Did he have a fever? I don't know. Did you see him in the hospital? No, I wasn't allowed to. After he died, were you given a death certificate? She says, no. Did they ever give you a cause of death? She says, no. Every single question was no. I asked her also, I said, you have children. Are you receiving any subsistence from the Brazilian military? She said, no.
Do you think she genuinely didn't know, Dr. Leir, or do you think she was told
I think that
to say no?
I think she was put upon, and her answers were all negative because she was afraid to say anything, because this British television station that I mentioned last time I was on the show did an interview with this deceased military police officer's wife. Not the wife, the sister. And the sister told about certain symptoms that he had. But just recently, in August of last year, there was a conference held in Varginha, and a doctor came forth, a Dr. Furtado. And Dr. Furtado happened to be the physician in charge of this deceased military police officer's case. And he spilled the beans.
Did he really?
He told what he died from, and we know that it wasn't a bacterial infection. We know that it wasn't a parasite. We know that it wasn't an injury, but that he died of some compromise of the immune system. And all indications is that he had what is called a viremia, and some of his symptoms, putting two and two together, were very similar to what you might find in an Ebola. Infection. So we could say it's some virus-like entity which probably compromised his immune system, and he died. Dr. Furtado told all about this just last year, and that's also in the book that I wrote about. Now, the other being, the injured being that Marco Eli Charese took to finally wound up at Regional Hospital. When I was there, another doctor came forth, an orthopedic surgeon and asked to talk to me. And I met the man. He didn't speak any English whatsoever, but we hit an instant rapport. He took me in first to see one of his patients, which happened to be a foot case. He had x-rays up on the view screen. And we were able to converse easily in medical terminology. So we had no problem. And in fact, I helped him put a cast for this patient's fracture. So we went from there into another area where actually we did the interview. He wanted no recording devices, no cameras, and no names. He would not give out his name to anyone. He did give it to me. And he swore me to secrecy, to not mention his name anywhere in Brazil. I haven't mentioned it anywhere in the world.
Right.
But again, very respected orthopedic surgeon. And he made a disclaimer. He made a disclaimer saying that the information he was about to tell us were rumors. He had no first-hand knowledge, and he heard this from friends and colleagues in the hospital, and that it was a total disclaimer. And then as we began to ask him questions, what did the creature look like, and so on and so on, he became more serious, and more serious. And the story that he told was an amazing story. Now, he saw that there were military personnel walking about the hospital, but he didn't think that was unusual because with a military base not that far away, sometimes they brought in injured military personnel. So they were kind of used to seeing military people in the hospital. But what finally became obvious was that there was more than usual, and they seemed to be not allowing civilian personnel to go into certain areas of the hospital. They cordoned it off, including the surgery area. Then finally he was asked to come into the surgery area, escorted in by military personnel. He was to scrub, put on his scrub suit, gown. He walked into the operating room, and they told him, do not come out until the job is done. And he was there to repair a fracture. He didn't know what the patient was. He saw something small on the table. He thought it was a child until they pulled back the drape sheet, and he could see it was not a child. It was not a human.
Can you imagine seeing that?
That's right. He was in a state of shock. And he could tell by the x-rays that there was a fracture of this creature's leg. So what he did was he reduced the fracture as he would with a human fracture, and he found that once the bone ends were approximated and put together, he didn't need any kind of a stabilization device to hold it because it immediately started healing. Immediately.
Wow.
I asked him about the blood. He said the blood was red in color, very similar to ours. Very similar cellular structure, except that it had a platelet count. The blood was much higher in platelets than our blood. And he said the bone was pink in color, very similar to ours, but it had cavities, or what he called lacunae, in the bone, which gave it a greater tensile strength than human bone. And so he did the best that he could with what he had. They closed it up, and he said the wound and the bone healed within a 24-hour period.
Do you think he will ever come forward, Dr. Leir? Do you think he'll shed light on this in years to come?
I think, I've honored my agreement with him not to mention his name and so on. I feel that if I went down there again and were to talk to him again, he might not only come forward with more information, but he might have that one elusive piece of physical evidence. Maybe somebody copied a report.
Right.
Maybe there's a blood test. Maybe there's even an x-ray that was left or thrown out. It was a bad film, throw it out, and so on, that they didn't confiscate or take. Maybe it's there, and maybe he would give it to me.
Wow. And you'd come back on the show and you'd reveal all of this with us.
First thing, Tracie.
Wow, that would be awesome. What we're looking at here, Dr. Leir, is the entrance to where the exit, I guess, behind the hospital, where they actually brought the creatures out.
That's right. This is a photo taken from the rear entrance of Humanitas Hospital. Now, the creature left Hospital Regional, and I asked the doctor, I said, what condition was he in? And he said, it's satisfactory medical condition. And that is a specific medical term. And the medical term means that the patient, all the vital signs are present, and he's ambulatory. It means he's walking okay. So he was taken out of there from Hospital Regional, which we're showing now, and from there immediately taken to Humanitas Hospital. And the testimony that we have, the medical testimony from nurses and other personnel in the hospital, was what happened to this creature there. We know that something happened to it. We don't know what. They gave it resuscitative treatment and tried to give it oxygen. We know that the very next day, where we showed the rear entrance of the hospital, the creature was taken out in a casket and loaded onto a military truck and taken away. And again, this is the picture of that.
Now, didn't the doctor that treated this being, didn't he have some telepathic messages from this being?
Yes, there was one interlude when the surgery was finished with the being, and he said in the first place he didn't want to look the being in the eyes. So the eyes were like looking into two pools of liquid. But suddenly, he said, the room began to fill with a greenish mist. And they didn't know what it was, whether it was toxic, but they couldn't get out. So they tried to get out, and the military said, you know, if your job's not done, don't come out. And they noted that this mist seemed to be coming from the creature. And he turned around and looked at it, and he said he could not remove his eyes. And during that period of time, he said large thoughtgrams, is the way he talked about it, were downloaded into his head like he was being hit over the head with a hammer. Boom, boom, boom. Resulted in a headache, a migraine-like headache, which he said lasted for over 2 weeks with nausea and vomiting. So I asked him, I said, can you tell me anything that this creature imparted to you? And he said, well, I am only going to tell you what he said about human beings. And I said, yes, please tell me. He said he felt sorry for the human being. And I said, why? He said, for 2 reasons. Number one was that where he comes from, it would not be necessary to have a specialized facility to treat the wound, for example, that he had, that either singularly or joining together, they would heal their own. And he said that human beings have the same ability, but we don't know how to use it.
Wow.
And the next most profound thing was he said that they felt sorry for humankind because we were totally disconnected from our spiritual self.
How true that is.
Now, the end of this conversation ended, let's go back to the beginning. Here's a doctor, well-respected doctor, who was telling me all the things he was about to tell us were just rumors. The conversation ends, the interview ends, he's sitting in a chair, his head is hanging between his legs, his hands are shaking, and there are tears running down his face.
My goodness. That's quite an incredible emotional moment there for him, I'm sure.
It was an emotional moment for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you think back to the Peter Jennings special, Roger, that happened a few months ago, is it any surprise that this event was not even mentioned in that primetime special?
Not a surprise to me. One of the reasons is that Peter Jennings himself had nothing to do with the production. He has a production company, which is Peter Jennings Productions. They give them assignments, and they went out and they did their assignments. And then when it comes back to the final cut on the program, somebody, I don't know who, gives their input. And from what I understand, it was more than 50% of the material and interviews that were never shown on the show. So they didn't, hardly mention anything of anything. So, but the UFO community was not happy with the program. But yet when I talked to people off the street or my patients, they got an entirely different view. They said it was a wonderful program.
Really?
And I said, what is it that you liked about the program? And they say, oh, didn't you see the interviews with the pilots and the military police and all the people that saw things, and these were all credible people. My gosh, this was wonderful. And then I'd say, well, what about how they treated Bud Hopkins? And they'd say, Bud who? Or some of the other things. How about Roswell being a cult? Oh, I don't really know anything about that. But my gosh, did you see all the stuff that they showed? Different opinion by the public.
A mixed bag of opinions there.
Right.
Do you think this event is bigger than the Roswell event?
I don't necessarily think that it's bigger, but I think that it's more important, especially now, because you have to look at the situation. The Roswell event is over 50 years old. The eyewitnesses to the event are slowly dying away, and there's less and less of a chance for the ability to interview any of these witnesses. But in the Varginha event, there's more witnesses coming forth all the time. Let's just look at the military witnesses. Their term in the military is a lot shorter than it is with our military. And when they get out, they talk. On this interesting shot, this is the area I was telling you about where they came down the hillside. The military personnel and the fire department came down the steep hill, crossed this railroad track into this empty field, and then went into the cluster of trees. And by another 2 eyewitnesses later the same day, you can see how thick the forest is there, but it's only a small clump of trees. They saw that happening repeated over again without the fire department, just the Brazilian army, and they saw 2 officers, military police, military personnel, I want to get that correct, come out of this area. They heard gunshots fired. And they saw these military army personnel coming out, one with a sack over his shoulder and another person with a sack over his shoulder. They saw movement like kicking in one of the sacks, and the other sack was quiet. Both came up the embankment, struggled to get back, put the sacks into boxes, containers on the back of a military truck, and boom, taken off again for Sergeant's camp.
Something else I want to bring to the attention of our audience today is this particular magazine in Brazil. The editor is A.J. Javard, another great researcher out there in Brazil, a good friend of yourself, Dr. Leir, a wonderful guy, and he's the editor of this magazine, and you can see on the front cover there the picture of the being with the red eyes and the 3 protrusions there. With all of these sightings, Dr. Leir, that is going on over the planet, the United States, England, Brazil, India, is Mexico even, which country do you think is most likely to come forward to say they're here?
Well, that's a good question, Tracie. I mean, it's all speculative, but as many times as I've been to Brazil, and with all the activity going on there, I really didn't peg Brazil to be the first one to release this kind of information to the public. I thought, personally, it might be France. France is sort of a renegade country with a lot of money. They've spent a lot of money. The French Space Administration has put more money into the European space rocket program than any other country. And they're real rebels. They don't mind what they say. And they've had, the Comité report that came out of France by very sincere French scientists and high-up military people. So I kind of pegged France for this. Don't cross them off the list yet. The information from Brazil is solid. Why it isn't getting, it should be on Larry King, CNN News.
Exactly.
It should be even on Bill O'Reilly, but
exactly. I totally agree.
We don't see anybody talking about it.
Yeah, I also want to say that I would have thought that Mexico might have been the country to actually come forward, because they've been having incredible sightings of flotillas of UFOs, even up to 500 UFOs. And of course, Jaime Maussan, one of the main investigators there, was talking recently at the Nevada UFO conference and showing this amazing footage.
Well, you got to remember, the politics of Mexico are closely allied with the politics of the U.S. The relationship between Vicente Fox and President Bush is pretty tight. So wherever you find this close, tight relationship, you not only you see the problems of a large quantity of the Mexican population coming through our open borders. I mean, everybody recognizes that as a problem, but nobody does anything about it. I mean, you can just imagine something that they've been told to hush up and keep secret, they're going to do it.
Right, right, exactly. Were there, at that time, back in 1996 when all of this happened, were there any talks, speculations of abductions?
Oh yes, Brazil is quite famous for abductions. Some of the same things going on with abductions that go on here or in Europe or in Israel or any of the other countries. I've been to 42 countries, and the abduction program is about the same no matter where you go. However, in Brazil, for whatever the reason, in the jungle, in the Amazon, there has been abduction scenarios which are a little bit different than what you hear elsewhere, because some of these have maimed people, and some of these things are very, very bad. You don't hear about them. You don't certainly read about them in the newspapers either, and you don't even see it in the ufological literature. So that's kind of kept quiet because it's pretty scary. Now again, you say, oh, what's the purpose here? Why are they doing this? We don't know who they are. You know, it could be all sorts. You know, some may come here because they want to hunt people. Who knows?
Exactly. We don't know, do we?
No.
That's the speculation. There's many reasons that people keep putting forward.
Right, and I always like to say, Tracie, and let's get it out to the audience of this program, that if anyone expounds about their knowledge of this subject, ufology, and claims to have all the answers, put your fingers in your ears and run.
You know, what do we know? What have we learned about this special event, Dr. Leir? You know, were they benevolent creatures? What have we learned from all of this?
Well, I think my conclusion is that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That there was certainly no talk of any weapon of any kind ever talked about by any of the eyewitnesses. Why weren't they wearing clothes? I mean, obviously, a race of individuals who has the technology to travel, you know, light years, let's say, through space, it would seem that they would be wearing clothes. So obviously, they didn't expect to have happen what happened.
Right.
Maybe in the environment of their craft, maybe it's not necessary to have clothing, or maybe that the clothing or covering would impair whatever it is, their modus operandi. So to me, that's not an act of a hostile being. These beings, you know, I could well feel sorry for. They were, as I said, probably in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Dr. Leir, with that, I thank you so much for coming by and seeing us today. Thank you for sharing the story. We thank you for joining us today too, and check out Dr. Leir on our website, letstalkparanormal.com. Once again, Dr. Leir's website is alienscalpel.com, and the book, UFO Crash in Brazil. And until next time, keep an open heart and an open mind, and keep your eyes to the skies as well. Bye-bye.